So on behalf of the Sri Lanka Resident Mission and ADB's Independent Evaluation Department, a very, very warm welcome to all of you. A bit about the event. It is in the backdrop of the severe economic downturn of 2022, after which Sri Lanka's economy is now showing signs of stabilizing. So the question now is, how can Sri Lanka sustain the present momentum and get the country back on the growth path? Experts say this crisis is not a temporary liquidity shock that can be resolved by external financing support. It is a result of long-standing structural weaknesses. A strong and credible structural reform program is critical to address the root causes of the current economic difficulties. The collective support of international partners will also be needed to maintain the reform momentum and chart the course for a speedy and robust economic recovery. Now, policy-based lending, or PBL, or what some other organizations also call budget support, is an important instrument to help the government in their reform agenda. Sri Lanka government has an ambitious reform plan, and MDBs like the ADB, the World Bank, etc., are supporting them implement this ambitious and reform program. Today, we will delve into lessons from the past evaluations to understand how we can enhance the effectiveness of policy-based lending. What has worked in the past? What can be done better? So that the government and the development partners can ensure a better targeted assistance. And on that note, I'd like to call on the stage Principal Evaluation Specialist, Yurendra Basnett, to provide a brief overview to today's discussion. And he is one of our very senior evaluation experts, has a lot of background in operations, so there can be nobody better placed than Yurendra to make this presentation. Yuri.
Thank you, Saleha, for that very generous introduction. I'm not sure if I'll be able to live up to it, but I'll try. Very good morning to you all here in the hall, as well as those joining online. So I'm going to do, as Saleha mentioned, a very brief presentation on drawing lessons from evaluation on how we can make policy-based lending more effective. My presentation is going to be in two parts. The first part on what is policy-based operations, specifically at ADB. And the second part is going to delve into what are the lessons that we can draw on to ensure that going forward, these operations are more effective and delivering the kind of results that they were intended to. So policy-based operations, ADB uses these instruments to support its developing member countries undertake reforms. It has some key elements or components of it. Often ADB will provide policy dialogue support, technical assistance, and also budget support. And it often entails either as a standalone one-time budget support or is done in a programmatic manner. What we see from data is that the demand for such kind of support has been increasing over time. Of course, there was quite a spike during the COVID period where there was an increased demand for counter-cyclical support. And what we also see is that in South Asia, although not as much as in other regions where ADB operates, but nonetheless in South Asia, we see an increasing demand for policy-based operations. In terms of sector, we see that policy-based operations often focus on public sector management and financial sectors. And in terms of when we compare that to infrastructure projects, they tend to complement when they are done together. And I'll come back to this because we also have an instrument called Sector Development Program that combines policy lending with project investments. So let me turn very quickly to Sri Lanka. We were talking about Indonesia, and it was stuck in my mind. In Sri Lanka, we've used policy-based operations as part of a sector development program in the past. And lately, we have seen an uptick in straight policy-based budget support being provided to government in undertaking the reforms. And I'll come back to that again. And what we also see is that in Sri Lanka, ADB's engagement is multi-sectoral, covering a wide range of sectors from transport, public sector management to energy. Now, let me turn to the second part of my presentation, which is on what lessons can we learn from the evaluation of past completed policy-based operations, and how can we use that lesson to inform future operations that ADB and other multilateral development partners are currently engaged with the government. So what we did was we looked at evaluation reports for completed programs, particularly from 2018 to 2023, on what you would consider as outliers. They were either rated highly successful or less than successful, to glean out what were some of the factors that informed, or what were the factors that drove the ratings. We also synthesize findings from a longer evaluation that covers a longer period from 2008 to 2017. And the findings, what they suggest, and many of this might be familiar to you, but nonetheless important to underscore, policy dialogue is critical. This can often be long and laborious, but policy dialogue is critical to generate or foster commitment of all the stakeholders involved in the reform process. Diagnostic, doing sound diagnostic to identify what is the constraint that the reform intends to address is critical. And again, what we find is when you have a robust diagnostic, it helps build consensus, draws the minds of all the stakeholders to addressing the problem. Complexity, we see that increasingly the instrument is being used in multi-sectoral reforms. And in those cases, having clear understanding of what is the constraint is of paramount importance. Otherwise, there's a risk that the reform program can become diluted or does not address the constraint. Quality of policy action. It's quite important to note that these policy actions or reform measures don't happen in a vacuum. As all of you know, there's a political process to it. They are contested, and very seldom do we get the opportunity to adopt first best options. Often we have to go for second or third best option. And so we have to be mindful of that. Technical assistance has been flagged in our evaluation for being very important, because many of these reform measures require technical support to the authorities to implement as well as design these reform measures. And monitoring. Monitoring helps keep the reform momentum and also provides the learning to make any necessary adjustments. We also looked at experience in Sri Lanka. And in Sri Lanka, as I had mentioned earlier, the approach in the past was to combine policy-based operations with project investments. And what we find is that readiness of the program becomes extremely critical, particularly when you are undertaking investments and reforms within a sector. We've also seen that excessive number of reform actions or policy actions can be overwhelming. And so there's a key consideration for prioritization. We also, in Sri Lanka's case, and I think it's probably relevant even now, capacity building. This entails knowledge, but also providing technical inputs to the executing agency and implementing agency is quite important. So IED recently did a validation of the self-assessment of our previous country partnership strategy for Sri Lanka, and flagged that going forward, we need to prioritize fiscal reform and public sector management. And as you can see here, and we've got our country director, Taka, here, who will of course speak more to it, that public sector management, public financial management is a strategic priority of our current partnership strategy. Now, let me turn to lessons, or the so what question. And I want to leave with two points. First, if we are to make the policy-based operations impactful, what evaluation lessons suggest is the critical importance of having a clear theory of change. That means having a clear line of sight on what is the constraint, what is the policy action or reform measure that is being undertaken to address that, and what are the results that are being or outcomes that those reforms are intended to generate. I also want to point out that as a policy-based operation, it has a unique feature because it is supporting government's reform, but it's also providing budget support. And so making sure that the overall budget analysis, the quality of the budget becomes extremely important. And there are broader macroeconomic implications of such operations that also need to be taken into account when designing such operations. Second, what I want to also flag and highlight and leave here is that the importance of embedding monitoring and evaluation in the design stage. And I think when we look at the past evaluations and the lessons from it, those preparing policy-based operations could already ask some of the evaluation-related criteria to strengthen the design of the program, asking questions of, is the program relevant? Using the relevance criteria to see, is the program that is being designed, does it have a clear results chain? Trying to see, are we doing the program in the most efficient manner? What are the risks to the sustainability of the outcomes that the program intends to target? And relatedly, and this is something that kept coming up in the evaluations, is that often the new policy-based operations tend to forget the historical past or prior reforms in the sector. So it's quite important that any new operation takes into account what were the lessons and experiences from the previous operations. Finally, let me conclude with some key takeaways. So in our view, government commitment, robust diagnostic, clarity of policy actions, and M&E are important ingredients to have successful policy-based operations, and evaluation lessons can be quite useful in the design of policy programs. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Yuri, for that very insightful and also very, very engaging presentation. But don't go anywhere, because in the designated question and answer session, we will invite the participants who are here. If there are any questions that you want to direct to the presenter, please do that. Now, you might see the gLOCAL Evaluation Week, the Global Evaluation Initiative written on the posters. And in case you're wondering and you don't know, this event is being held under the overall banner of the gLOCAL Evaluation Week. So this was launched in 2019, and over 1 week this year, from the 3rd to the 7th of June, participants from around the world join in and organize in their neighborhood, across the seas, like we have come, these events. And these are to inspire and energize a global movement which values the power of evidence to improve people's lives. I tried not to change the way they've defined themselves. So that is the banner under which today's event is taking place. gLOCAL is convened and supported by the Global Evaluation Initiative, that is GEI, a network of organizations and experts that supports countries with strengthening their monitoring and evaluation systems to help governments gather and use evidence that improves the lives of their citizens. And with that, let's get straight into the panel discussion. And we have a very eminent list of panelists. So I should not stand between the discussion that is going to take place and you. Panelists, as I announce your names, may I request you to please come here and take your seat. So I'll start with Mr. Vijay Anuradha Kumarasiri, Director General of the Department of National Planning, Ministry of Finance, Economic Stabilization, and National Policies, Sri Lanka. A very warm welcome to you. Dushni Virakun. Thank you. She's the Executive Director, Institute of Policy Studies, Sri Lanka. Thank you, Dushni. Richard Walker, Senior Country Economist for Maldives and Sri Lanka from the World Bank. Welcome, Richard. And last but certainly not the least, we have Takafumi Cardono. He's Sri Lanka Country Director for the Asian Development Bank. Taka. And to moderate today's session, we have the Director General of the Independent Evaluation Department, Nani Jimenez. Nani, it's over to you now.
Thank you very much, Saleha, and a very warm welcome to all of you, and a warm welcome to all of us who are visiting wonderful Colombo this time of the year. In my case, for the first time since 2018, and really pleased to be here. So I want to thank the panel to reflect on from their different perspectives, from government, think tanks, and donor partners on the issues that Yuri raised in his very interesting presentation on what evaluation has found about enhancing the effectiveness of budget support, which is not always an uncontroversial issue, I might say, because some people often say, well, why are we giving just transferring resources to the central pot as opposed to lending money for specific projects? And I hope we can have a very interesting discussion about that. So if I might start with you, Mr. Kumarasiri, from your point of view in national government, especially as DG of national planning, can you just briefly outline for us what are the main objectives and reform priorities of the government now, and how can multilateral development partners like the World Bank and the ADB ensure that their budget support is as effective as possible in your government?
Thank you very much for your question. Before that, I have to thank ADB organizing this event to share the findings of the evaluations as well as the sharing thoughts, and especially focusing the policy-based loan. Two heads, one from the World Bank and from the ADB also here. They are the one who has already provided support to Sri Lanka in recent past. And why we had taken these options, policy-based loan, why not investment type of projects? I have a little mix of thought before go to your question. Yesterday we had the delegation from Bangladesh at the Treasury. One question raised by the officer from the Bangladesh government secretary to the Ministry of Planning Implementation. What is your view of getting policy-based loan? Whether you go with the investment-based loans, basically project loan. My personal view, we have to go for the investment type of projects rather than getting policy-based loan. But you can argue why. But for the time being, we had an issue with the fiscal issue at the government. Therefore, no option other than the policy-based loan. And we are entering into the crisis of Sri Lanka. Therefore, definitely we have to reform our current issue, to focus the current issues to overcome those challenges issues in the future. Therefore, I have to thank both World Bank and ADB come up with a lot of reform agenda with the policy-based loan, and also we call DPO, development policy operation, both entities. But we know that our issues, we have a fiscal issues and also structural issues within the Sri Lankan context. Therefore, we have to address both fiscal issues as well as the structural issues. I believe that the recent past, we have done a lot of reforms. Everyone knows, and most of the reform approved by the parliament, and some are still debating at the parliament. Hopefully, we will get those reforms. And to focus our development agenda, right? Therefore, we have to address those issues. Otherwise, we might not be able to expecting a developed country. Now, we basically manage the financial sector reform very much, and also public PFM bill already at the parliament to address a lot of issues at the treasury level and also implementation. I want to address two issues raised by the presenter. the evaluation, monitoring and evaluation. Other one is, he said, project readiness. These three issues are main issues within the government. And are we really doing the readiness of the project before start the project? Even though circular has been issued and we are working with the relevant implementing partners within the government, but when we start the project, there is no much readiness, though we are expecting. There are challenges we have to sort it out. Very recently, we finalized with the World Bank one health sector project. We insist you have to give us an entire detailed action plan with the cost and the timeline, unless NPD is not in the position to recommend the project. Otherwise, after signing loan agreement, only they will come up and start the project preparation. No, in future, NPD will not recommend any project unless project is ready for the implementation. This is one. And as you point out correctly, the lesson learned from the previous project, very much we concern. And the project submission format, recently we revised it to accommodate a lot of issues, challenges faced by NPD to accommodate. But complaints are coming from the agencies because it is lengthy format. We have to fill. But yes, you have to fill. We have to have a base data. We have to have information. And you have to identify the output, outcome, impact, indicators, everything. Without that, how can we go with the expected results? Therefore, you have to be very fully understand your project concepts and everything and design and look at all the environment issues and other challenges and come with the proposal. That is expecting the good results in the future.
Okay, thanks very much, Mr. Kumarasiri. Maybe we'll get back to your other points, but and also in particular, I think we'll get back to your point on project readiness. But Dushni, if I could turn to you, Mr. Kumarasiri also pointed out that budget support in particular is really important for Sri Lanka because it's facing fiscal issues. It's a quick way to get resources in, but also to support structural reforms. So from your point of view as a leading think tank head, what advice would you give to the development partners to the left of you on how to make sure that their budget support achieves those objectives?
Thank you very much. Let me also, first of all, congratulate ADB on that presentation. It was very insightful. My view on Sri Lanka's economic reform process and the role that different forms of lending have played, we've not had a very successful reform agenda that we managed to implement. We talk about reforms, but I think the last time that we did any substantive reforms was more than 2 decades ago. Now, as Mr. Kumarasiri said, in the last couple of years, we've seen major changes, particularly on the public sector finance side, but that is because primarily a crisis does focus the attention on the need for getting some of these things done, and particularly for a country that's at default, that's having a bailout program with the IMF, all of those are part of the conditionalities. And the policy-based lending that the multilaterals have provided have enabled some of the supporting reforms to be funded. Now, to me, policy-based lending, I see 2 advantages in that it doesn't have the same degree of conditionalities. It provides counter-cyclical macroeconomic support to a government, particularly immediately as it's needed. But there are downsides, and I also didn't quite get a sense of that from the presentation that was made. To me, policy-based lending tends to be somewhat of a shorter term. And in terms of the evaluation, looking at whether it's been successful or not. On certain criteria, yes, you can say it's successful. I saw Pakistan, you ticked as successful in fiscal reforms, but then look where Pakistan is today. So attribution is a problem on policy-based lending, whereas project lending, I think there's much more clarity on that. Now, for a country like Sri Lanka, where we struggle with the reform process, I am still not convinced that policy-based lending experience of the last couple of years has addressed the key weaknesses. And Mr. Kumarasiri knows we've been on so many committees, this, that. Policy making is happening through ad hoc committees. It is not entrenched in the government administrative bureaucratic system. With every change of government, there's a revolving door of experts and advisors coming in and out. Capacity requirements in the public sector is identified as a key priority for strengthening. And sometimes the government says we bring outsiders in because public sector capacity is not strong enough. But I mean, I believe there's even a capacity building program going on today. But what we find is even the capacity building initiatives, in a couple of years, if we come and ask, where are the people who were trained? We can't find them because they've been dispersed. Those units have been dispersed. So how do we ensure that these weaknesses are addressed in the current round of policy-based lending? It is somewhat easier in a narrow environment like public sector management, but when we move on to the more broader reform agenda, whether it is in education, whether it is in health financing, you know, the problems are going to be that much broad. And we can see that already, all the bills and everything that is being challenged by trade unions, etc., because that committee system does not lend itself to the public dialogue that you mentioned, consultative processes. So despite the evaluation, I still don't have a handle on whether we have addressed it in this last couple of years.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Dushni. And in the spirit of think tanks, you pose challenges for both the policymakers and the evaluators, and I want to get to those. So I'd like to turn now to our development partner panelists. Dushni has laid out very clearly that there are big pluses to policy-based loans because they get the money out quickly and doesn't face the shovel-ready issues that Mr. Kumarasiri pointed out. But there are questions on whether this is the right instrument to address key constraints in the reform process, and also this very tricky issue of capacity building, which investment lending perhaps might be an easier target for. But Rich, can I start with you? I mean, the World Bank has always been known as in fact, probably invented the precursor to policy-based loans. They used to be called structural adjustment loans. I'm old enough to remember those. So as you and your colleagues designed the next generation of these loans, how are you taking into account some of the key issues that our previous colleagues have raised?
Yeah, thanks. Firstly, just to say thanks, ADB, as well for having us here today. Yeah, I mean, I'd like to come back to some of the issues. I made some notes here and to talk through that a bit as well. Maybe just quickly to reflect on the presentation, I felt it resonated with a lot of our approaches and the learnings we've had. So you talked about policy dialogue, diagnostics. We would talk about that as just our consultations, which would include the analytics as well, all of that, which helps bring partners together, which should ideally start helping to address some of these issues that you raised in terms of the capacity, maintaining the dialogue, reaching the right people, including the right stakeholders. And I agree. I mean, I think that's an area that's challenging. I would say in the Sri Lanka context, it wasn't easy, given in 2022, when we started the exercise to prepare some of these loans, there was quite a fragmented crowd of stakeholders, and to identify and reach the right stakeholders, as well as the sort of broad enough in terms of representation, it was challenging. So maybe just to reflect there first. The second thing I'd say, yeah, I mean, you talked about policy action quality. The key thing on this side, as we talk about credibility, reforms really need to be credible. They need to be transformative. They need to make a change. I think we talked about this theory of change matrix. What are we actually trying to achieve here? This all comes down to credibility. And another aspect of credibility is around political will. is there the will? Is there the motivation to get reforms done? I think this comes back to some of your points as well. For example, Sri Lanka, challenging time in 2022 to develop this commitment, this political will. And of course, through that, we certainly made some mistakes, perhaps. We looked at some of the reforms weren't perhaps the right ones or weren't necessarily perfectly designed in the right way. And I think this comes back to another point of mine on the presentation is around a programmatic approach. I didn't see anything on there about lessons from whether one-off policy-based loans achieve better results or whether programmatic achieve better results, and how long is a successful programmatic? How many years, how many operations do you need? Perhaps it's not a question that's easy to answer, but it would be good to see the evidence there of which of those very successful ones, on average, what were their length and how many operations did it require? Which comes back to, I think, again, you may not be able to pick the perfect and correct reform straight away. You may understand your reform direction and area, but there may be steps in order to get there. And you need to design and lay out those steps. And along the way, also trying to then build the political will, the commitment. And ideally, as you sort of, in many respects, it is a long game, I would say. If it's a long game, you can help build the capacity. You can help hopefully retain some of that capacity. So maybe that also responds to some of those points. You talked about, the TA, the support, the design, the capacity building. We sort of group that under, and this is, when I say we, I mean, this is particularly the team who've worked on Sri Lanka. We've looked at sort of these pockets or areas of issues that needed to be addressed. Coordination is critical. We found on these kind of loans, you often work with the Ministry of Finance, and there might be more capacity there. There might be a better understanding of the reforms and the necessity for these reforms. But once you start moving out to some of the sector ministries, the line ministries, who don't have this sort of collective view on the purpose of reforms and maybe have a very sector-specific focus, they may not understand as well. They may not have the commitment to the reforms. And certainly we've seen also often they don't necessarily have the capacity to work with this kind of instrument when they're more used to working with investment type loans. So just that resonates as well. Maybe the final point, I know you wanted us to be relatively quick here, was the one thing I didn't see there as well, and we've learned in this one, I would say quite strongly, is communications. You talked about policy dialogue, but I interpret policy dialogue as between ourselves and the counterparts, maybe some relevant stakeholders, perhaps with other development partners. But when we say communications, it's with the general public. It's with very perhaps unrelated interest groups who really need to be brought along with the reforms. You can see now there are quite a few of these reforms in Parliament. For example, Public Debt Management Bill, Economic Transformation Bill. What else is there? Electricity Bill. A lot of it's in there at the moment. There's been a lot of challenges, a lot of dialogue, and perhaps we could have eased this process along the way if we'd had better communications and even perhaps better design some of these policy reforms. So the communications, on our side, we've pushed quite hard for government to take leadership in this. We feel government should take leadership in this. In this situation, because of a lack of capacity and just with everything that's going on, I don't think there was sufficient communication. And as a result, we've also tried to step in on our side with sort of a modest exercise to try and communicate. But I think, and I admit, it's a bit too late on our side. It would have been nice to have done this far earlier. So when you're designing the reforms, when you're structuring a sequence, all of that, you can start incorporating these lessons. But again, better late than never. And just to finally say, this communication exercise, it's not just sort of a 3-4 month process. I think this needs to be a really ongoing exercise where you have some sort of platform or mechanism to identify champions, but also those who are opposing the reforms and allow a constructive dialogue. And not just let social media sort of take over some of the messaging around reforms.
Thanks a lot, Rich. And I want to put Yuri on notice that I will give him a chance to address some of the questions raised on your presentation. I think that there were questions raised about conducting evaluations themselves and the very tricky issue of attribution, among other things, and the issues about the programmatic approach and communications that Rich just just mentioned. Taka, if I could turn to you, I mean, Rich outlined, I think, a very important point about how the World Bank is approaching policy-based loans, and that is perhaps not see them as a one-off, that perhaps a series might be sometimes helpful, in which there are sequential reforms, and also to make sure that perhaps they're accompanied by capacity building as well as just the transfer of resources. As you implement the new CPS here, country program strategy here in Sri Lanka for the ADB, congratulations, by the way, on starting that this year. What is the role of PBLs in that portfolio, and how are we tackling the issues that have been raised now on the challenges to having effective and impactful policy-based loans?
Thank you, Emmanuel. And thank you everyone for joining this morning. And thank you, fellow panelists, for making the time. Before I answer your question, I'm more of a projects person. So I hope this is not recorded. It is, but I used to think PBLs or DPOs are it's an exercise where you find what the government was already doing in the last 12 months and try to provide budget support based on that. So I had this very skeptical view when I came here as a country director, actually. And I was going to drag in Yurendra as well, because you worked in Indonesia a lot. And I think Indonesia, Philippines, I know like about 50% of our operations are policy-based loans, right? And of course, there's a financing gap, but it's also because the government feels maybe it's easier to get budget support rather than investment because they may have constraints on procurement or other things. However, Amani, as we have approved the country partnership strategy, or our board did, for 2025 to 2028. And because of the IMF program, there's a strong impetus for us to deliver budget support using our policy-based loan instrument. And we are, of course, harmonized very well with the World Bank's DPO as well. And what we are doing here is really working real time with the government to help implement these reforms, right? So this is not just taking credit of what the government would have done anyway, but working with them. And this is part of the capacity building as well. We provide technical assistance. We go through, we conduct diagnostics and policy dialogues so that we can ensure that the reforms that are being implemented are meaningful and are sustainable as well. I think what Dushni mentioned, I mean, on the surface, we do see there's a strong commitment of the government, and that's why we are supporting all these reforms. But you are right, many of them are led by committees, right? So the longer term sustainability is something we are not concerned, but we are keeping an eye on. And that's why we take this programmatic approach. I think the difference between the World Bank and our approach here is that I think, Rich, your DPOs are more broad, all encompassing, right? While we take a more sector specific approach. So going forward, or already, we have dedicated PBLs in financial sector stability, power sector reforms, water sector reforms, and then we have the SDP, which links PBL and investment, the sector development program in tourism, agriculture value chain and commercialization, and social safety net. All these things are coming up. Actually, we had last week, the Deputy Secretary to the Treasury was in Manila to conclude our country programming for the next 3 years. And as Dr. Kumarasiri also mentioned, there was, he emphasized, the DST emphasized that the government would like to see more external financing for investment that would spur growth and with real returns. But however, as you have all mentioned, because of this current circumstances, they need to rely on budget support through PBL. He stressed that they are going to do these reforms anyway, so they don't want more budget support than necessary. Here, it's kind of clear. I think the parameters are clear because you have the IMF's financing table, right? So the expectation more or less is clear to us and to the government as well. What we try to do is to select those sectors where there is strong commitment and importance, and then to provide support in a sequential manner, like you said, Manny, in a programmatic approach so that we can ensure that the government's capacity is built over the medium term, and also monitor that there are no policy reversals. If there are reversals, then we need to stop and have a rethink. So that's the general approach that we are taking.
Just a quick follow-up, Taka. Given that the ADB is following this more sectoral approach as opposed to all of the economy approach, do you find that that approach is more conducive to addressing the enabling environment to make our projects successful? I know, for example, that pricing in some of our sectors is a real issue.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, that's a great question. So for us, and this was a discussion last week as well, we want to gradually return to financing investments, right? Not just hard infrastructure, but like in education, health as well. But for us to resume that or to get back to the previous levels, we want to ensure that the sector reforms in those sectors are making good progress. So there's that linkage. I think this sector development program where we go ahead with both PBL and investment at the same time is one approach as well, right? Because when there is a actual cost to the structural reform, then that makes more sense. But related to what Rich said about working with the line ministries, I think if we take a focused sector-specific approach, we can engage more with the line ministries and their utilities and whatnot, and build their capacity. But of course, it's a general budget support, right? So many of these line ministries ask, okay, well, we are experiencing this pain, but we're not getting the money. So, we have that issue, but I don't have an answer for that.
No, thanks a lot. Mr. Kumarasiri here, can I turn to you? Dushni mentioned that perhaps here in Sri Lanka, there's been more success in reforming the financial sector because of the crisis. Do you find that given the political economy in government, that you really need a crisis to address the hard reforms that you have to tackle? Or can that be addressed in a more, in a better way when the government has more leeway, when there's no crisis?
No, I think government took the opportunity with the crisis to do a lot of reforms, because that pain we learned already with the crisis situation. Everyone had that experience. Therefore, I think this opportunity we should take at this moment. Forgot about the past, but for the future, at least this initiative we should take. This is the time. Everyone talk about, and there was a Aragale, right? Everyone said we want to change. This is kind of a change we are doing at the moment by the government. That's maybe the opportunity. And I agree with Dr. Dushni. We have not touched many areas to be reformed or maybe restructures. One of the areas is the public sector reform. I do agree with Dr. Dushni. We have to look at seriously, and maybe ADB or World Bank or any other agencies can do diagnostic study what happened to the government sector, where we are lacking, where we want to strongly improve ourselves. Because since I'm government sector, we know that we should improve ourselves, and capacity need to be built, since government spending huge amount of money for the implementation of programs, projects in the country. Therefore, I think look at our challenges and issues faced by the existing public sector. There should be a reform, and unless otherwise, there will be another issue maybe coming years. Therefore, I think this strong message I have to say. And we know that even World Bank, ADB, they know that when we are implementing the project with the implementing partner, there are a lot of issues and challenges. Even the procurement process, is a huge challenge for us. It's almost all the projects are delayed. I think DPMM officials are here. We know that all the projects are delayed, extending years and years, and price escalation all accumulating. Therefore, I think there are some issues we have to identify, diagnose, and we have to reflect within the reform agenda. Maybe public sector also one of the important area.
Oh, thanks. So maybe we need a crisis in the public sector. But I want to touch on this point because I've been in development for many decades. And I remember when I started my career that the issue of capacity building was raised even then when I first started out. Vishni and maybe my MDB colleagues, any success stories that you recall in which the development community has been able to address tricky issues of capacity building, which are long-term in nature, and what could we do to support countries in this really hard slog?
I mean, I think with the best intentions of development partners, unless the governments don't recognize that to some extent they're contributing, and maybe to a large extent they're contributing to the problem, then there's a limit to how much development partner support will facilitate capacity building. To me, I mean, I worked in the Sri Lankan development's, public policy engagement for decades now. And I see an erosion of independence of the public sector. And that is politicization across entities, because if you go against any government directive or the minister's directive, they will shunt you sideways to a department that, where you're losing your career prospects. And that's not healthy, because my institute, we are semi-government. We don't take money from the government, but we work with ministries, departments, agencies, and that there are good people. But when the overall culture of that pervades the system and inhibits that independent thinking, it's not healthy. So Mr. Kumarasiri is right that, we need to have a diagnostic of looking at the Sri Lankan overall public sector. Where can we make certain reductions? Pay needs to go up. They need to be better paid, etc. But at the same time, the institutional frameworks within which they are allowed to operate must also change. And that is for the government. I mean, one, I would think, for instance, the new Central Bank Act to give the central bank a little bit more independence in its operations is somewhat like that. But the public sector in general, I think, also needs that change along with whatever support on capacity building that comes from development partners.
So capacity building is not just about more workshops, but really about how to make sure that the whole system is is working. If I could turn to my colleagues in the MDB world, I mean, public sector management is an issue that a lot of our budget support operations have tried to address. Any hopeful signs, success stories that you could share with the audience on what might work to make sure that these really wicked issues are being addressed? So first, Rich.
Sure. I mean, I think maybe I'll come back to the Sri Lanka context, maybe just to this point that we've been talking about, an assessment of the public sector. When we came in to look at the reform agenda and what needed to happen, you look at the headline numbers, just for example, that clearly there wasn't sort of an obvious expenditure adjustment that needed to happen. Levels of expenditure here in Sri Lanka are not vastly different from other countries, and in many respects are more modest. Whereas you look on the revenue side, it was a huge, huge issue. You were hugely, as a country, below revenue performance compared to peers, and as well as compared to potential. So in that respect, and you will have seen as well, a lot of the reforms have been around improving revenue mobilization. And then linked to that, a lot of work with the tax administration, really trying to invest in building the capacity, building the systems, and building the ability to broaden the tax base, not just about taxing the same people more and more, but broadening this base. And I wouldn't necessarily say that's a success yet. I think there's a lot of work to do, but I think that was a key area of capacity building that a lot of effort is going into from a lot of partners that needs to be supported for the long term. In terms of the other side of the equation, into the looking at public sector management, really the sort of expenditure side, what's happening there, the institutional side. So we've actually just started an exercise to prepare a public finance review, which is quite a significant piece of work that we invest in. It looks at really the levels of spending, the efficiency of spending, the equity of spending. We're trying to look across government, central, local, also try and incorporate to some extent SOEs. And this is the exercise, and we have been working with DG and his team on some of this, that we are investing a lot of time in, and at the end of that, hoping to then pinpoint some key reforms. And I think, as I said, it's not about the quantity of spending in this situation. It's really about the efficiency. So looking at public investment management is a key area, the capital expenditure budget. How is that being managed? How are projects identified? Are we getting the bang for buck here? Looking at the wage bill. And certainly wage bill is not excessive. There's no issues there, but how is it structured? Is it more reliant on overtime? Are there too many employees, et cetera, et cetera? So there's work to be done to dig into that. And just to say, I mean, fully agree, there just wasn't sufficient diagnostics or analysis for us to enter into a reform agenda around the public sector and on the expenditure side. And we hope through this exercise, and we will share this material with others, that this will now become a reform exercise.
Thanks. Taka, what is on the same issue?
Yeah, I think it's time for the Q&A. So just quickly, I forgot about three important PBLs that we do in the public sector management, and trade and investment, and sustainable finance. These are the three that we are also working on, especially on the PSM side. I think we're working quite closely to harmonize, and it's not really related. Maybe it's not directly capacity building, but rather than just going for the primary legislation approval as a policy action, we are taking cue and dovetailing. Like, for example, if the World Bank was supporting the primary legislation, we would come in at the secondary, tertiary legislation level, so that we can help operationalize these laws. And part of that, through that, hopefully, capacity will be built to actually implement that. I think similar, like on the SOE reform as well, right? I think you are supporting more the SOE reform law. We are supporting the operationalization of the SOE restructuring unit. And I think you are also helping to design what will become the SOE holding company. So there's that linkage there as well. So I think maybe this is a message to the evaluation department that we are sometimes criticized for being process oriented, and we don't have very strong legislative actions. But I'm new to this space, but I really feel that it's not just that headline legislation. It's more beyond that, and it's, I think, reflected in your question to us. So thank you, Manny.
No, thanks. And any follow-up, Rich, especially in this issue of all of our owners in the MDBs are pushing us for more donor harmonization. And do you think that are you happy with at least how our two institutions, but there are other donors here as well, on how we're working together without being perceived to be ganging up on government?
No, I think actually in this situation we work well. I'd say, I mean, firstly, there was this economic crisis, and amongst the partners, ADB, some UN agencies, ourselves, others, there was an economic, well, even before that, there was an emergency recovery committee that was established to really identify what are the essential services that need support at that time. Where can we help bringing in cooking gas, medicines, etc. So we worked together on that. And then out of that, evolved this MDB Plus platform, whereas the IMF came in, of course, the two of us, our institutions, there was USA, JICA, others who were really interested in the reform agenda, the macro stability and recovery type reforms. And that's been a really useful platform I mean, firstly, that meets often. I think that's quite key. So we catching up with each other all the time, but it's been a really useful platform to discuss the kind of reforms that we're looking at, to share our policy matrices in terms of these are the areas we're working on. What is the overlap? Is it useful to have overlap, or should we rather complement each other, split out some of the reforms? And I think as an example, this has been a good one in Sri Lanka. I actually, as I said, I work on Maldives. Maldives, we are just starting a very similar platform, this MDB Plus, to start dealing with some of the macro fiscal vulnerabilities and debt issues in the Maldives.
Thanks. Mr. Kumarasiri, are you happy with how the donors are behaving themselves in this regard, in terms of making sure that they're well coordinated and not being as painful as they sometimes are in countries, having individual needs that need to be catered to?
That's what I was thinking when he's talking about. We know that development partners have their own mandates, and also they are very interesting area, and sometimes they are very expert on some area. Therefore, we know each and every donor agencies, development partners have their own agenda also. And we try to have a consultation or dialogue among the development partners. Even we ask them to have a dialogue among them when we are having a very specific area. Even we are trying to explain them, we are working with this development partner and they are doing similar activities. Why don't you have a consultation among the development partners? And then we have to identify where the gaps, because everyone will not cover every area. Therefore, we have to look at where the gaps are. And then we have to ask development partners, why don't you come up with some solution, since we are having some gap, some area. Therefore, that's what we really talk about, the government, public sector reforms. No one is coming and giving us this opportunity parallelly with other reforms. That's the one issue. And we don't blame them, because that's the nature of the partners, their expertise, their mandates, and their interest. We should understand that.
That's really great to hear. Now, I want to give the audience a heads up that after I turn to Yuri, I'll be entertaining questions and answers, both from our online audience as well as the people here in Colombo. But Yuri, let me put you on the spot. I don't want you to answer every question that was raised about your presentation, but if you could also reflect on the challenges of assessing policy-based loans or other budget support operations in relation to investment operations.
Sure. Thank you, Manny. And thank you for those reflections. Just very quickly, Ms. Dushni, that was really interesting thing that you picked up. I should have clarified that actually the program in Pakistan was self-assessed to be successful, but the evaluation department downgraded it to be less than successful. And there were a few others in the list as well. I presented both the self-assessment and the evaluation department. The second question, Rich, you'd asked about programmatic approach. So all of the data that I presented actually are for programmatic approach at ADB, which tends to be 3 to 4 years duration. Could be longer. There's few cases where the reforms haven't been undertaken for a variety of reasons. And the program has extended beyond that usual 5 to 6 year time period. But most of the data is for programmatic approach. We also have the counter-cyclical facility, but that is quite small to the overall programmatic approach. The third point on attribution that was mentioned, I think this is sort of the most critical and the most difficult part in terms of making that, you have a high level bill or a law that has been amended, and then you trace that to the outcomes that you are making and attributing that this caused those outcomes. And there, I think what we see is what Taka you were mentioning. There has to be additional actions and measures that help operationalize and they become the stepping stone towards the outcome that you are expected to see. So merely passing a bill or a legislation might not deliver the results that the reform. And we've seen many instances where laws or bills have been passed, but they've not been properly executed and operationalized, and therefore the effects of that intended effects were not achieved. My final point, I think, Manny, if you allow me, on the budget support, and I did do a Freudian slip on the stage. I mentioned Indonesia, where I used to be, and I think Taka, you mentioned that again, because we do have a very large policy-based operations in Indonesia. What I, being there on the other side, not in the evaluation, but as a mission leader, I still recall one of the blows that I was processing. The vice minister there said, "Don't tell me what I already know, tell me what I don't know," right? And for them, the point being, the money part, the fund flow is minuscule. Whether ADB or World Bank provides that budget support or not is not the critical aspect. And I was curious, and what I learned was, for them, the knowledge aspect, the knowledge of that ADB or World Bank and multilateral partners sit on, that they can draw from the experiences, not just the operations in the country, but regionally and elsewhere, is what they've thought was valuable and wanted to partner with us in the reform agenda. And just to stay on the Indonesia, and I think might be useful for Sri Lanka's experience as well, because it's recovering from a crisis. I went to Indonesia almost 2 decades after the Asian financial crisis, but you could see the aftermath of that crisis very much visible, right? So a lot of the people who were leading the reforms were, in fact, seem to have been trained during that crisis, post-crisis period, right? So capacity was indeed built during that period. A lot of that through multilateral development partners. And I think there might be some lessons to draw or experience from Indonesia that could be relevant for Sri Lanka as it thinks about the government administration reforms and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you. As they say, never waste a good crisis. Okay, so let's take a couple of questions. We'll take a couple of rounds. Please keep your questions short and identify individual panelists if you'd like them to address it. And please identify yourself before you ask the question.
Thank you. I'm Chandima Wickramasinghe, representing the Presidential Secretariat. First, thank you to the panelists and the presenter also for those insightful views. My question arises from the fact that we are associated with the policy-based lending loan by the ADP. And again, the question of attribution. We have a number of policy-based actions, and once the requirements are fulfilled, I guess it's the boxes are ticked and we go on to the budget support. And correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that budget support is not linked in any way to the outcomes or the impacts of the policy-based actions, because in the evaluation cycle, as you said, it stops at the output level. And the country director, ADB, just mentioned a little while ago that the policy reversals can be monitored. So I'm not sure whether it can be tied up to the policy-based loan effectiveness, but then again, I don't see any connection. They're just disconnected. So I'm just wondering whether there's a possibility of the policy-based loan lending scheme to have some kind of connection to the budget support loan as well. I'm not sure, but just to ensure the sustainability of the policy-based activities, because I am personally a little concerned whether the policy-based actions, there are 6 actions, whether they would be sustainable too far into the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody and panel. First of all,
Can you identify yourselves, please?
First of all, I appreciated ADB and World Bank because ADB assists to this training program, capacity building in Sri Lanka. In South Asians, candidates also participate. This is support to the Sri Lanka. Foreign reserves also, some dollars came here. That's the thing I appreciate to the ADB. I expect in future also ADB will and World Bank will doing this type of training program. Okay, then I will discuss about this policy-based lending and investment-based. How interconnected both? I have interesting story because my one of friend asked from me assist to the woman-headed disabled family 1 million rupees. I asked, where is this money? He said, when your Corona time and crisis time, he deposit, he's in foreign, he deposit the dollar account and rupee account. He earned some interest. He has money. He don't back get to the his country. He like to invest or support here. Then I advise him, yes, we have the Samurti and Aswesuma, poverty people there. You can support 1 million. This is the base. They have good lifetime 50 years houses, can establish new houses there. You use solar panel, 3 kilowatts. Then he can earn the revenue 12,000 from that 12,000 per month. He can use his livelihood. Here, 3 concepts I identify. Environmental. It's a green energy.
So do you have can you pose a question, please?
Question mean this both policy-based and investment-based, how interconnected here? That's a story. You know, the government get the money, borrow from ADB, policy-based for the welfare facilities. My comments, how can interconnect the investment? This like the solar panel fixed to the poverty people, then they create a loan. We can remove the beneficiary from the social welfare. Then we can reduce the Ministry of Finance burden. That's my argument.
Thank you. Thank you.
My name is Pradeepan from Ministry of Finance.
Thank you very much. Okay. One more question from, and then we'll take another round.
My name is Maksuda Hossain, and I'm from Bangladesh. I'm working in the Ministry of Planning as a Joint Secretary. And first of all, I would like to thank ADB. They can arrange such a nice and wonderful discussion that many questions are parked in my head. But I just want to ask you one thing. You know that in Bangladesh, World Bank, ADB, and JICA funded so many budget support projects. So one of my colleagues shared with me, and I sometimes also join their program. She's working in World Bank Development Credit Funded Comply project, which is the guideline of MYPIP, multi-year project, multi-year investment, public investment program. So she thinks that, and me also, when they made the guideline, after making the guideline, it will not work successfully because government policy and this guideline policy sometimes contradict. So my question is, what do you think, especially the World Bank and ADB, if government sustainable support program is not successful, maybe due to the reason of time duration or other, maybe reform is sometimes contradictory. So what is your plan to next plan for the sustainability of this project, especially the budget support projects? And I also want to know, do you have any plan, especially World Bank, for this kind of projects? You can think loan support or facilities in the future. especially the budget support. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So a couple of questions on especially on sustainability, as well as on the interconnectedness between projects and budget support. So Rich, turning to you, a couple of questions addressed specifically to the World Bank.
Sure. So this is on, yeah. Yeah, maybe let me start with the sustainability of DPOs. And I think that was also connected to the results in terms of how do we achieve these results. So, yeah, I mean, a policy action or a policy measure at the end of the day is a commitment and agreement between ourselves and the government. And just to say the conditionality, I would say, of DPOs is certainly not easier than IPFs. IPFs, you can prepare them, you have some conditions, and then obviously the implementation can get tricky. But on a DPO, we set up relatively tough prior actions, things that have to be met. So effectively, the project's finished before the funds are dispersed. And when I say finished, these policies are done, completed. And we, in completing those policies, we, in our analysis, we line out sort of a sequence of events from that policy to what ultimately you want to achieve. If it's, for example, to improve exports as a share of domestic, GDP, what do you have to do to maybe liberalize tariffs? There might be some decision there. And we see a sequence of events that could lead to an increase in exports. Of course, you can't attribute it all to this policy measure. So, so then comes sort of another side to the exercise, is where we would continue to provide technical assistance, capacity support, but then most importantly, this is when we can also bring in these IPF, these investment projects. So a good example, and coming to the connection here, is in Sri Lanka, this Aswasuma program. So setting up a new social protection system. That was around the dialogue, the policies, what had to be done. A new welfare benefit payment scheme legislation had to be prepared and enacted. The social registry had to be developed. Targeting criteria had to be developed to identify the poorest and most vulnerable. So at the end of the day, government was targeting the right people, but us as an institution were happy that the right people were going to benefit from the funding. That then we came in with an investment project to help bring some of the financing that was required to support the new social protection program, but then also to continue to invest in the systems, the need to recertify, the need to keep doing analysis to understand whether you are still reaching the right people. How do you build the institutions? How do you build the capacity? That all comes from an investment project, which ultimately supports the initial DPO, we call it, or policy-based loan. I think this is quite true. I mean, in several areas, we're working on a new investment law. We were working on an SOE law as well. We were working on tax administration support. A lot of that we would ideally try and follow up with investment type projects to ensure the sustainability of these reforms. And maybe just one more point I'll mention is that in the reforms, we've realized that if you're looking at measures like cabinet approval or submission to parliament, often they are reversed. You see evidence of this, that they don't get sustained, they don't eventually make it to parliament, they don't make it through parliament. So in this situation, we've been quite firm in terms of ensuring that we try and reach the end point as far as possible as we can in the policy reform. And often this is to, say, implementing regulations of a bill that, or a piece of legislation that has been passed in parliament. Taka referred to some of the work they're doing, supporting some of the work we're doing to actually implement some of the regulations. But then also it comes down to setting up the institutions. So a key institution we're looking at supporting set up is the National Commission for Women. We're supporting these gender equality, women empowerment bills, but effectively we want the end point not to be parliamentary approval of that, but actually the constitution, the establishment of this commission. So hopefully that answers the questions.
Thank you.
Sorry, on the Bangladesh one, I wasn't quite sure maybe we could chat afterwards on that one. I don't work on Bangladesh and I didn't quite get the specific question on the project, but happy to talk.
Thank you, Taka.
I don't have much to add on this, honestly. I think it was already well responded by Rich. But Well, I guess like so the volume of the PBLs or the DPOs are not directly linked to the strength of the policy actions or how many policy actions there are, right? I guess in the past there was a trend that you would have more and more policy actions trying to justify the volume maybe. Nowadays, I think the trend is that we want to be focused on smaller number of meaningful actions. So again, I mean, the volume of the PBL, the policy programs are dependent on the financing gap and what the contribution of the other development partners, right? I mean, that's the way it is decided. And the policy actions are decided separately. But of course, there is that perception that there should be certain linkages. So that's the tricky part. For example, like in the power sector, we are doing, it comes in a 3-part series, subprogram 1 this year, subprogram 2 next year, subprogram 3 the following year. And they are all slated for $100 million each. So, and there are what we call reform areas. We have 3 reform areas. And as we progress in the sub-programs, the actions become a little bit more demanding, meaning that they build on each other going forward. And through that, we hope that we can build that capacity. And then, for example, one of the policy area is encouraging the private sector to invest in renewable energy. Like wind or solar. So that's on the legal regulatory side. But once the private sector starts to invest, the transmission line system needs to enhance capacity technically. So for that, we will come in to provide sovereign investment financing to CEB or whoever the successor company is so that they can build that transmission system. And also to enhance quality because tariffs are going up. People are, of course, unhappy. If the service quality is bad, then, you know, it's a double whammy for the consumers, right? So the prices go up, tariffs go up. We need to ensure the service quality goes up as well. So if there's investment needed there, we will provide support as much as we can. So that's the kind of linkage, especially specific to the power sector, at least. Thank you.
Thanks. And either of my Sri Lankan colleagues care to add anything?
I just want to just give some feedback. Mrs. Chandima Wickramasinghe highlighted the policy-based loan, how it linked with the actions maybe. I also do agree with her. Now we have done a lot of reforms and also some agenda. The implementation of policy actions is key. And we have to have a plan and how we are going to implement. And one example now, some actions are already taken, but the implementation is ahead. But I think we have to have a similar modality when we develop this policy action DPO. We have a series of discussions, consultation with the government entities to complete the process. The similar arrangement may continue for the implementation of those processes to at least verify whether we are doing right way or right direction. That's one. And her just mentioned the connectivity with the budget support and also the implementation. I don't think we have done it, but just giving money to the government to invest where the real issues and challenges are. That's one. I don't know whether ADB World Bank, after giving money, verify whether the money allocated or given to the government, looking at where you have invested. I don't think they are doing it, but it's just after complete the process, they are giving funds to the government for the budget support. That's not much follow-up of both the agencies. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Another set of questions or comments. Someone in the back, all the way in the back there.
I'm Chandani Vijayawardena, Senior Additional Secretary to the President. This regarding education sector, our recent experience in the under the new policy framework of education, we are fully aware of the long-term assistance given by the World Bank in the improvement of the education sector, entirely skill sector. I have two questions to ask, not questions like two concerns to express to you. One is on the effectiveness when you in the ultimate goal of the policy-based loan is to see a transformation in the particular area. So one problem we came across was the ADB CECIT project was mainly involved in curriculum development. That has been done very well by the NIE. I don't know whether the Education Ministry is represented here. It was timely implemented, and by the time it went to cabinet, the cabinet or the observations from the Minister of Finance inquired about the relevance to policy, education policy. So when the education policy was questioned, the education policy that time was not approved by the cabinet. So there was a question, and that time, fortunately, unfortunately, the process was implemented on formulating the national education policy framework. So the observation of the president was to already done work of the curriculum development, and some significant amount of money has been spent to wait till that alignment is established. So that's something that puzzled us, whether the NIE as a authority developed the framework, curricular framework, the reforms, but the relevance to policy has not been established by the ministry or by all authorities.
Okay, can I ask you to,
Yes.
we're running out of time. If you
Sorry,
could voice your
the
question, please.
Second question. So how this can be addressed in future policy of loans? Second question was the development, this policy-based loans are coming to as budget supports. So the approval process is different. The ministries are allowed to spend, but the approving of for a project, they have specific approval process, but this is given as routine budget. So that has been spent. And how so that authority is not very specified. So that is the second question I have.
Okay, thank you. Okay, can we take any more questions?
Just quickly to respond on the
please.
education. Of course, I'm not an education specialist, but I understand this the project you mentioned, CECIP, the secondary education project, right? Which adopted a modality called the result-based loan, which is PBL, not PBL, P4R in the World Bank. So they have a disbursement linked indicators, DLIs, and some of them are related to reforms, policy actions, right? So I guess as that project was going ahead, the National Education Policy Framework was introduced, and there was some differences because the RBL, the ongoing RBL was aligned to a previous policy. So as the government introduced this NEPF, to which some of our colleagues, ADB experts provided input to as well, but because of that misalignment, we had to hit the pause button, right, to ensure that they are aligned. So I don't think it's an issue in this case. Of course, it has delayed the disbursement, but as far as I understand, the new national education policy framework, the direction of it is consistent with the direction we want the sector to move ahead as well. Just minor tweaks. I don't think it's a major issue. Do you want to take on is the second question on the fungibility of the loan proceeds of DPOs or PBLs?
Okay, so let me just start by saying, so not every country is eligible for this kind of operation. I think what's important to say is that as an institution, we will do an assessment of the fiduciary arrangements. We'll do an assessment of the budget planning, budget approval, budget implementation arrangements. So all of that takes some time, and we need to be happy that certain standards are met, that safeguards are in place, that there is a level of transparency, there's an effectiveness around spending. Because as I said already, I mean, the operation is basically done, is completed before the funds are dispersed. So in that respect, once the funds are dispersed, we will be happy that the operation is completed, at least for that operation. Of course, if it's part of a series, then we need to move on to the next reforms to continue the impact of this reform sequence. But once the funds are dispersed, then yes, they go into the budget, and we have faith. We've done our assessment of the systems that government will spend it in the best way that they can in terms of the development of the country. So we don't follow the financing. Of course, there is an agreement that funds are not spent on certain things, but that's clear with government. But of course, spending on the different sectors, health, education, investing in infrastructure, those are all pro and positive development ways to spend, and obviously to reduce poverty and develop the country. So that's just to say yeah, I mean, that's effectively, I think, what you might have been getting at. I mean, the approval process, I think you mentioned that briefly at one point. The approval process of this is really, again, I mean, we have key counterparts. We work with technical experts who may work with ministries, line ministries, who are responsible for the reforms. Once sort of we're happy with the quality and the standard, it'll be signed off on our side. Government will also then consult. Often you bring in the Attorney General, the legal drafts person, prepare that. That would go to Parliament, then you would have to implement it. So that's sort of some of the stakeholders in the approval process that we would go through.
Thanks. I was wondering if, Dushni, you have anything to add on this issue of fungibility and from as an observer of how these loans are dispersed.
I don't think I'm the best person in this panel to answer that question, but I mean, from point of view of taking a step back from the government and donor partnership, an institute like mine, we do socioeconomic research and analysis. We have close contacts. We are fully aware of the reform proposals on the table. But I think, there is a disconnect, or that communication outside of a very small circle, an engagement of stakeholders in shaping those reforms, in having the opportunity to express their views, opinions, and have those taken account of, is completely missed. And I'm listening to this dialogue. It is government, it is donor, but resistance to some of these reforms are building up because of their exclusion from that engagement in that process, or having the opportunity to engage in that process. And I think that we really need to fix that, because policy-based lending is going to be important. I know Mr. Kumarasiri has other he prefers to have the investment, and government may prefer to have the investment for purely economic reasons. But sustainability of this current recovery will depend on whether or not we are able to sustain that reform momentum. Plugging investments is not going to help us. It will take us back to where we were earlier. So that reform initiative has to continue. But if there is no general public support for these kinds of reforms, we are going to again take 2 steps forward and 3 steps backward. So I think in any discussion that the donors are having with the government, that's fine. That has to take place. But in designing any of that engagement and lending, there has to be also clear commitments from the government. How do you build stakeholder participation in this? Theory of change. We do theory of change when we design our research programs to see what is it we are trying to change, and who are the actors along the way that we need to influence. But we don't do that when we design policy change between bilateral engagements between donors and governments. And I think that's critical, because if you leave it to governments alone, they won't do it. And donors also, it's not their responsibility so much. But
I think this is a great topic for our panel to take a final view on. And I know, Rich, you already talked about the need for communications and how important that is. And any last thoughts on what are effective ways that you've used to get that communications and with whom?
Yeah, okay. I mean, look, I totally agree and understand what you're saying. And I think, but to some extent, I would also disagree. So this could become an interesting conversation.
We don't have
That,
time.
no, we don't have time. But yeah, so I mean, on our side, as I said, we've tried to work with local think tanks, someone like Advocata. We've done a series of town halls across the country. We've done significant amount of focus groups with sector specialists, private sector, civil society, trade unions, even talking to some of the array of political parties. And then also from that, we had a sort of central event where we presented some of that, but now we're also engaging on quite a strong social media campaign around the reforms, trying to address, as we see questions coming in, concerns coming in, putting out messages. And as we've said all along, we're really interested in speaking to the opponents of these reforms. Last point, I said, of course, we would have liked to have started this exercise earlier, but I think when we came in 2022, it was a lot of urgency and there was a lot going on. And I think at that point, we didn't necessarily plan in a reform communication process as sort of closely and specifically as we should have.
Thanks, Mr. Kumarasiri. Not all governments are comfortable with very broad range communication strategy towards very diverse stakeholders. From the government's point of view, is this an approach that is comfortable for you?
Yeah, of course, comfortable. But only thing is we are working with a very tight schedule. I think they understand we have a deadline and we are trying to meet the deadline. Therefore, the consultation take long time. Therefore, we have a challenge with the consultation plus the deadline. That's the main issue. Of course, coordination, consultation, communication, very important. And in the meantime, we are meeting the deadline also. Thank you very much.
That's very good to hear. Taka, last word to you on what you're doing a year into your job on this very important issue of reaching out to our major stakeholders here in this country.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, thank you for this opportunity. And I'd like to learn more about how PBLs are evaluated, actually, so that we can do a better job. But I guess sometimes I feel that there's not enough like diagnostics, right, or study on the impact of these policy actions. And I think this is something the Ministry of Finance had also admitted as well, that they do not have capacity to, for example, if they change the VAT from 15 to 18%, what is the impact? Of course, on the revenue side, maybe they have some idea, but on the distributional impact amongst the...
We have done the distribution.
Oh, you have? Okay. So you have shared with the government. Okay. Okay, the IRD. Okay. Very good. Yeah. So some of that, I think there's we can do better, and working with institutes like yourselves who have the expertise. And I think that would help shape our programs better, and also the reform actions more robust as well. So I think that's something that we want to do. And as you know, in ADB, we won't have as many economists like the World Bank, but we want to enhance our ability to undertake more research and analytical work. So gradually, we'll be able to strengthen that aspect of our operation as well. Thank you.
Having worked as an economist in both institutions, I can assure you, Taka, it's quality, not quantity, that matters. With that, first, I want to thank all my panelists for a wonderful and engaging discussion on a very critical issue. It's quite apparent that budget support or policy-based loans are an essential but not the only instrument in our toolkit. And in the challenging times ahead, we will need every tool at hand in order to address the wicked questions of crisis and development. So please join me in giving our panel a very hearty round of applause.